Hello, I'm Ezra. I'm the host today, and we'll be talking about schizophrenia, and more precisely where schizophrenia as a diagnostic category falls between the two poles of neurodiversity on the one hand and the disorder paradigm on the other. Schizophrenia has been cited by many as the awkward example that deflates the entire project of neurodiversity. It is considered to be the most extreme and the paradigmatic form of severe mental disorder that is simply incompatible with the more accepting and more depathologizing model that is the neurodiversity movement and the neurodiversity paradigm. We're going to talk precisely about why it seems so awkward in the face of the neurodiversity paradigm to talk about schizophrenia in the first place, and whether that awkwardness is more apparent than effective. As I said, my name is Ezra. I'm a philosophy student. I've been reading primarily about the stigmatization attached to the diagnostic category that is schizophrenia. Sander, on the other hand?
I've been researching mostly on the person-first perspective and help from a social from a person-based and also on what social help from the social perspective could work.
Especially with an interest in schizophrenic people's own voices in this debate, because they're also often left out and considered unable to speak for themselves. Vasilis?
Hello, I'm also a philosophy student and a psychology student, and my main focus will be on naturalism and the response of neurodiversity to it.
Okay, Max?
Yeah, I'm Max. I'm also a philosophy student. My focus is mainly on the neurodiversity perspective. Mainly, I'm studying. I've read a lot of researches about the refutation on the classical medical model on schizophrenia, and I think that's it.
Yeah, I think that's a lot.
And my name is Tom. I will be talking about the social constructivist view of schizophrenia, about the spectrum of behavior that schizophrenia is on, and how it can be integrated with the biological perspectives by neurodiversity. Back to you, Ezra.
It bears to begin with the most common definition of schizophrenia, which can be found in most diagnostic manuals. Before beginning this conversation, it bears defining schizophrenia, at least according to the most common formula describing that category in diagnostic manuals. According to these definitions, schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder characterized by disturbances in thinking, in emotional responsiveness, and in behavior. It manifests typically between the late teens and the mid-30s. It was renamed schizophrenia, in Greek the splitting of the mind, from the two words
Schizo, which is splitting, and phrene, which stands for mind, soul. So it's basically like the splitting between the two hemispheres, one would say, or of the mind in general as a whole.
And a disintegration of the personality itself.
Yep, exactly.
Yes. This term was coined by Eugene Bleuler in 1908 to reflect the disintegration of mental functions. Diagnosis for this disease requires symptoms lasting at least 6 months, including 1 month of active phase positive symptoms, such as delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic behavior, or conversely negative symptoms, such as apathy or emotional unresponsiveness, alongside significant social or occupational dysfunction. While Bleuler emphasized disorganized thinking as a key feature, diagnostic criteria for the DSM have focused more on positive symptoms, such as delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech.
Yes, here I want to point out, although the term of schizophrenia was coined by Eugene Bleuler, Kriplin was also a person that's invented a concept that Bleuler was studied as schizophrenia. And then, these two guys were mostly the people that contribute to the birth of the concept of schizophrenia, and although these two persons are basically the guidelines for the afterwards research on schizophrenia, the original research done by Bleuler and Kriplin has, according to my reading, has a lot of flaws in it, and that is, firstly, a very suspicious thing on this concept of schizophrenia itself. If it's in its invention, it's already have a lot of ambiguity, then is it even really usable of this concept for today's psychiatry?
On that note, it bears pointing out that the invention of schizophrenia as a diagnostic category was primarily made to explain clusters of symptoms that occurred across different patient populations. As a result, schizophrenia was, at least in origin, intended not to describe some fundamental biological cause, but simply to posit that there was a biological unity that could explain recurring patterns of symptoms. This order of priority is an important one to remark on, because since then, medical and genetic research has focused on discovering what biological cause there might be to explain this common co-occurrence of symptoms. And yet, to date, no specific biological marker has in fact been. Okay, refer you to our shorts for more detailed and granular information about topics as varied as validity, reliability, stigmatization, and the research history of schizophrenia. For the time being, however, it bears defining what exactly we mean by neurodiversity and what we mean by disorder, given that we're trying to decide where exactly schizophrenia falls between these two antipolar categories. Neurodiversity is admittedly not one coherent body of thought or one coherent doctrine. It is both a social movement advocating for the rights of those classified as mentally disordered, and also an academic movement attempting to reframe the way we think about mental health conditions in the first place. It functions on the basis of an analogy between, on the one hand, biodiversity, and on the other hand, the massive variety of different neurotypes available in human populations. It suggests that rather than splitting humanity between normal and abnormal, healthy and unhealthy, diseased and healthy individuals, we should instead think about the massive variety of mental health conditions and neurotypes instead in terms of natural diversity. This means that difference is not pathological, or is not a dysfunction, or a failure, or a deficit of health, but is simply another way of being. On the other hand, disorders fall within a far more medical account and a medical paradigm that instead pathologizes difference and considers it to be a biological dysfunction, a failure of health. Disorders tend to be accounted for in terms of a naturalistic framework, whereby the disordered mental function is reducible somehow to an underlying biological, genetic, or neurological state. There are, however, serious difficulties in the application of a genetic, biological, or in any case disordered view to schizophrenia for reasons.
Yes. And the reason for that is lies on the concept of this, for example, the concept of schizophrenia itself. Like, firstly, the reliability of schizophrenia as a concept, in the sense that can we agree who is schizophrenic? That is, firstly, a problem, because a lot of studies have suggested that actually psychiatrists can't agree on who is schizophrenia, and the subject studied by one research is actually could be drastically different from other subjects studied by another researchers, and this I have me and Vasilis have made a video about it, and if you are interested in it, you can watch the short video.
Go check it, guys.
Yes. And then next problem is the validity of the concept of schizophrenia, in the sense that is schizophrenia what it claimed that itself should be, that is the theory on schizophrenia. If the theory of schizophrenia can indicate coherent symptoms and predictable outcomes in helping clinical diagnosis, and if this theory can match with the reality of how schizophrenic people act, or how they will be recovered and how their recovery will be, and that's me and Vasilis also made a video called Validity, and if you are interested in, go check.
But tying into this things of schizophrenia, there is besides the actual behavioral markers, there is a strong genetic link also between schizophrenia and direct family. About 40% of identical twins of someone with schizophrenia also share the disorder, and there is a 10 times more likelihood of someone with schizophrenia and their direct relatives to also have schizophrenia. And besides that, symptoms that are common in schizophrenia also present themselves in people that don't have the disorder when a relative does have the disorder. So there is this genetic link present in the disorder. That's actually a lot stronger than with other disorders.
Which I think is really valuable to look from this perspective, because the percentage is actually high. Although what you just said, Tom, inspired me to raise some awareness on the environmental factors that might be at play as well. And there are multiple studies about schizophrenia as well as autism spectrum disorders linked to the socioeconomic status of the family and the person that is being raised. And most of the times, a lower socioeconomic status is linked with schizophrenia. As we can imagine, there are multiple reasons why this can be the case. For example, one study took as participants people that lived close by to a highway, which might sound weird, but living close by to a highway usually attracts less rent, and this is an indication of low socioeconomic status. And it was indeed proven that people living close by to the highway, also due to CO2 emissions, etc., have higher occurrences of schizophrenia. All that to conclude that I would propose a more holistic point of view that embraces both biological, environmental, social factors, and this is a key model in psychology of the 21st century. It's the biopsychosocial model, and I think we all agree that a condition like that is more complex than it sounds and has to be viewed from an interdisciplinary perspective.
So what Max is getting to here is that there are some fundamental problems with the internal logic of schizophrenia as a diagnostic category, owing to its history in medical research and the context that generated it in the first place. They conserved some fundamental incoherences and some fundamental posits of a biological origin and a hereditary nature that simply have never been demonstrated. What Tom is getting to is that there are genetic factors that can partially explain schizophrenia, but that nevertheless fail to explain it in single, univocal, or perfectly definitive terms. And Vasilis, on the other hand, is suggesting that there is indeed more than biology to these symptoms in the first place. These experiences need to be defined and articulated in terms more expansive and more rich than simply reducing it to what may or may not be encoded in our genes. Sander, on the other hand, can discuss the social perspective in more depth.
Like the social aspect, it's a really interesting subject, really, because even though, like, especially when you're talking about the neurotypical the neurodiverse standpoint, and like the like lack of like biological factors that we like, that it's not really clear what biological factors make it so that someone has schizophrenia. It's still, especially in like the person first experience, like the personal experiences, they are still very much thinking about like this medicalized approach, because like they like, even like schizophrenia as a disorder is very much it's very much like it's a heavily discussed topic, but in the studies that I have read, it's very much like they're all person first or like bottom up studies, and there's a really clear pattern going on that the patient schizophrenia people with schizophrenia, like they really see the schizophrenia as something like they see it as like something that is like they see it as like as sort of a disorder. They see it as something that like just changes their personality. Like they see it like in like their first like the beginning stages, they see it as something like that just takes them over, and then in later stages they reflect on that and try to like recover their lost bonds or like recover their personality. They really like, just as Vasilis already said, like coming from the etymological like like they really feel like they have a split personality.
However, it bears noting that these experiences, these person-first experiences of the disease and diagnosis of schizophrenia do not necessarily derive only from the individual, and they are not inherent to the symptoms themselves. Indeed, studies have found that schizophrenia carries the highest stigma burden of all different mental diseases or mental disorders categorized in the DSM. This stigma arrives partially from a general context, partially from films and newspaper articles that depict all schizophrenic people as equally violent, equally irrational, and unable to be responsible for their actions. However, they can also arise from doctors themselves. Medical healthcare professionals tend to express extremely biologizing, essentializing, and naturalizing views of schizophrenia in a manner that is disproportionate compared to the way they think of other mental health conditions. Doctors are far less likely to talk about depression in terms of a fundamentally transmissible or hereditable genetic brain disorder, but they do still reserve those terms for schizophrenia. In so doing, they seem to singularize it as an especially pathological, hyperpathological, indeed, mental health condition that debilitates its sufferers and renders them unable to live anything even resembling a normal life. If all patients then are passed through this system that marks them out as uniquely ill and uniquely irrational, it is no coincidence that the patients might feel that their schizophrenia is an external entity that descends on their lives and disrupts it so radically.
Yeah, it feels like they're sort of like from like the diagnosis onwards, they're like sort of thrown into like a sort of system that really like enacts a certain like also self-stigmatization.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it's really hard, like especially with such stigmatization and like having trouble with like their environment, like trying to like, because it's a reoccurring theme that they lose with their like diagnosis a lot of their like friends and family.
On that note, it bears pointing out that doctors and medical healthcare professionals in general express far more pessimism in their prognoses towards schizophrenic patients than towards any other kind of patient. First-hand accounts of schizophrenic patients about their diagnoses all converge on the theme that once they were diagnosed, they had a massive sense of pessimism and of lost life chances, of being a radically different person, more likely to commit suicide or more likely to be institutionalized or to live in perpetual orbit around psychiatric hospitals. This is an impression that they receive firsthand from medical health care professionals themselves.
Yeah, which is it's really like, it's almost like especially when you read certain like papers, it's actually like kind of shocking to me. A good social environment can help a lot for the treatment of schizophrenia people. It's even like it's actually like this is like it's the social aspect. Actually, like it's really like it's really prevalent. It's also really based on personal, like just the personal experience and personal differences between schizophrenia people.
On that note, it's interesting to point out that much of the history conducted about schizophrenic people and the experience of schizophrenia have tended to focus entirely on the genetic origin of the disease or on the possible prognoses of the disease. As a result, they fail to consider or take into consideration potential alternative forms of treatment other than pharmaceutical strategies. Schizophrenic patients report that they feel that their interactions with the medical institutions that supposedly care for them are often limited to simply trying out different forms of drugs until they find one that works, instead considering, for instance, community care or more social forms of intervention.
Yes, and me and Vasilis made a video about antipsychotic, and it's about the actual effectiveness of antipsychotic, and there's a lot of data shows that antipsychotic actually is not as effective as what pharmaceutical company or the doctors or psychiatrists said. And if you are interested in that part of information, it's in the source.
A counterexample to that is, for instance, a series of recent studies that show that there are alternative forms of treatment available and effective in the case of schizophrenia. For instance, a series of architects undertook a study in which they analysed the effects of secure, stable housing for schizophrenic people. When people are in environments such as that described by Vasilis, where they are in poor economic conditions and unable to find secure housing or housing in quiet locations that will not trigger their hallucinations, for example, they are far more likely to then seek out more intense forms of medical care and potentially to require further hospitalization. Instead, if, for example, they are offered stable, supported, and fundamentally controllable housing environments where they are, to some degree, in charge of designing their own living conditions, they can minimize the danger of hallucinations or of triggers of that nature.
Supported by education, if I may add.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
These are preventative measures that have been discovered only since research has begun to converse with schizophrenic people themselves, giving them a voice in their own treatment and in research concerning them and their conditions.
I think this also brings us to like the difference between the positive and negative and the cognitive symptoms, because exactly the traditional focus has been on more positive symptoms, which has caused the focus on antipsychotic drugs, which has actually increased the
negative symptoms.
Yes, exactly, the danger of the intensity of the negative and the cognitive symptoms. Well, these symptoms are
actually more harmful than the positive symptoms such as hallucination, because hallucination itself is not really bad.
Exactly.
It's
It
more
is.
like if it's in a society, if society think it's bad, then like you say seeing things, it could be like more dangerous than you actually have a cognitive dysfunction. Like cognitive dysfunction is essentially just worse than hallucination.
Exactly, and the negativity of these positive symptoms, or like how bad they are perceived, is also dependent on these negative and cognitive functions. So when these cognitive and negative functions are bad due to antipsychotic drugs, this might alleviate the psychosis, but if these cognitive and negative symptoms are not as worse, then the psychosis that may occur are not even pathological,
Yes.
possibly.
On that note, it's interesting to point out that the negative symptoms involved in schizophrenia tend to be chronic. That is, they are permanent features of a schizophrenic person's life, and yet they tend to be targeted far less by treatment plans than instead positive symptoms that are instead episodic and far less of a sort of permanent, debilitating feature of life. They are very serious, but they are not the overall nature or the dominant note of these conditions.
If I may add to that, talking about the dichotomy between pathology and non-pathology, I think it would be valuable to offer some insights from a study from Powers and colleagues that studied a new population called chlorodient non-clinical population, which is basically, for those that don't know, as me before reading the study, a population of highly spiritually awakened individuals that report hearing voices, which belongs to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. However, the distinction here is made between distressing voice hearing in the clinical population and not distressing symptoms, which are reported from the Chlorodian population. So here the distinction I want to bring is mainly that the pathology of the symptoms is not the only measure to actually measure schizophrenia. There are populations out there that have the same positive or negative symptoms, however they report them as beneficent to them.
Not having any diagnosis on psychiatric disorder.
Yeah, exactly.
This reminds me a lot about like what like researchers found out when they did interviews or like bottom up studies about like schizophrenia. Like they came to the conclusion that like how to like recover from your like recovery is more than anything sort of based on like trying to like find your personhood, like sort of accept the fact that you have schizophrenia and like that the like negative effects that come with it are like just part of your like part of yourself, and then part of like what like that's just you, like that's something you have to deal with, and like that really like that's really like ties really well into like this what you like to study by powers, what you said before, like like not perceiving your like hallucinations as inherently bad.
Thanks for that.
Also, it ties into the whole neurodiversity thing, because it is about accepting your own neurotype.
Totally.
And I think you could argue that these antipsychotic drugs that have been the traditional treatment can be seen by patients as maybe an attack on your personality or your personhood. And a more person-based approach that focuses on a person's individual goals, neurotype, and goal can have an alleviating effect and is a better focus for treatment.
Before, however, we talk about schizophrenia from a neurodiversity perspective, I'll just summarize briefly what everyone has said here. People have made the point that there is more to schizophrenia and the experience of schizophrenia than mere biological factors alone. A great and indeed significant, and perhaps even a great part of the suffering associated with schizophrenia in the first place is instead of social origin, for factors that can range from the economic situation of its sufferers, which, in brackets, is also exacerbated by the social stigma attached to schizophrenia that make employment more difficult for those bearing the diagnosis. They can also be attributed to the medicalizing tendency attached to schizophrenia, whereby somebody with that condition can only be treated in pathological terms and must be entrusted to hospitals for the public safety. Again, we refer you to certain shorts talking about the representation of schizophrenic people as especially violent or dangerous. The other factors can be self-stigmatization, meaning that people tend to internalize a great deal of shame concerning their diagnosis and have a difficulty acquiring a sense of self as a result of their diagnosis. Finally, it can arrive again from a medical context in a form of more overt iatrogenic harm. Studies have shown, for instance, that when schizophrenic in-hospital patients report somatic pain, which is to say not related to their mental conditions, they are found to be less believable than a non-schizophrenic patient, and are therefore made to wait longer for the same treatment. They describe being ridiculed by hospital staff, and they describe being taken less seriously or as less credible witnesses about their own physical conditions as a result of their schizophrenia diagnoses, which fundamentally appear to dehumanize them and to reduce their credibility as rational actors. This seems to suggest that a neurodiversity perspective would be a vital supplement to the disorder paradigm. I'm nothing. Sorry, stop it, please.
Oh, okay.
And it's more humane to treat schizophrenic people as people instead of instead of schizophrenics, insane people, and using this stigmatization to even make their suffering worse. So this neurodiversity perspective as not necessarily complete the opposition of the classical medical perspective, but can be complementary to what the existing medical model, and to care about what schizophrenic people actually needed instead of asking what is wrong with them is
very much vital for this.
Yes. Thank you.
I think this kind of brings us to the neurodiversity perspective. So this brings us to neurodiversity.
Yes. That was just funny, sorry. This brings us to neurodiversity. Now, there are some apparent difficulties in applying a neurodiverse perspective to schizophrenia. Indeed, schizophrenia is very often cited as the ultimate counterexample to the neurodiversity paradigm in the first place. Just as people cite the figure of the gravely autistic adult who needs permanent care from a family member or from some sort of an institution to support them as a sort of counter-figure and a counterbalance to the autistic people advocating for the neurodiversity paradigm and movement in general, schizophrenia tends quite often to be mentioned as a clear case of harm, where the mental condition is not only a difference but in fact a dysfunctional difference, a difference that makes people unable to integrate into society and to live autonomous lives. However, it bears questioning whether this is in fact the case, whether in fact schizophrenic people are so chronically and permanently disabled by their very biology rather than by other factors. As people have discussed already, it is far more likely the case that there are social factors that render life so difficult for schizophrenic people. And moreover, that schizophrenia as a set of symptoms is far more varied than simply the most extreme forms of psychosis or of paranoia.
Tying into that, the onset of schizophrenia also often comes with a certain environmental trigger, like drug use or a intense stress factor, showing that it is, in a large part, also something that is environmentally made and not something that is inherently to the person itself.
And yet we wouldn't be questioning whether drug addicts are or are not susceptible candidates to the neurodiversity movement, or if they're sort of blatant counterexamples. Instead, a very sort of one prominent figure in the neurodiversity movement and one major academic proponent of that paradigm is Robert Chapman, who argues that schizophrenia is something more than an awkward counterexample to the neurodiversity movement. Instead, Chapman suggests that once you establish that schizophrenia can be absorbed and encompassed by the neurodiversity movement in a manner salutary both for its patients and for the movement itself, you finally unlock the true potential of that paradigm in opposition to a merely medicalizing, pathologizing perspective.
Yes, and I think the best way to destigmatize the people with diagnosis of schizophrenia is as a lot of research have proposed that we should just simply abandon the concept of schizophrenia and more focused on the symptoms that patient has. For example, if you have hallucinations, you are diagnosed with some hallucinative disorder, and then doctor should help you to treat your hallucination. And if you have paranoia, you should be treated with paranoia instead of just put these people all together and then treat them as people with schizophrenic. Like if you have cognitive dysfunction, you should be treated with your cognitive dysfunction. And this way of breaking down schizophrenia into the actual symptoms that cause patients to suffer. This way it will be more practical and will solve all these biological problems in the study of schizophrenia.
Exactly. So if I understand that correctly, to be medicalization and treatment to be more behavior-based than classification-based.
Yes.
To focus on what is actually a problem for the person and his or her environment.
So it's also like a patient-centered
exactly.
Tendency or trend that we are proposing here.
So what Max and Tom are proposing seems to be an internal variation of what can be considered applicable to schizophrenia in the first place. Even if we retain this term schizophrenia as a broad descriptor of a massive group of people who have historically received that diagnosis and who live under the conditions of its stigma, and the mechanisms whereby it is treated, it would still be profoundly beneficial to everyone involved, including to the researchers interested in that condition in the first place, to accept that it is not one monolithic block of people, and that it is not something to be homogenized and flattened into a single possible phenotype or a single possible prognosis, with all the harms that we have mentioned follow from that pessimism. Instead, to recognize the internal diversity of schizophrenia would add it to the wide spectrum of diverse mental conditions that the neurodiversity collects under its banners, the neurodiversity movement collects under its banners. Indeed, on that note, it bears pointing out that to exclude schizophrenia from the neurodiversity movement in general would be to singularize it and to mark it out as this especially different, real mental health condition that, unlike the rest of neurodiversity's constituent neurotypes, is really insane, really irrational, and therefore really in need of hyperpathologization at the hands of an only medical perspective.
And this also highlights the potential of neurodiversity to recognize both the thingness while also recognizing it is naturally on a continuum and something that is both social and not inherently pathological by focusing on the behavior and neurotype.
And here I think it's important to be mentioned that our stance is for the schizophrenic patient to be benefited more by his category being dissolved into its parts. So mainly being focused on the symptoms rather than the category itself.
Yes, and also there's a lot of research to be done about the genetic and the biological cause of the schizophrenia, but we are not denying that there could be the possibility of biological cause and genetic cause of schizophrenia, but the truth is all the researchers in neuroscience are focusing too much on finding that cause, and all of this energies, time and money invested on this research can be better invested on how to improve the people with schizophrenia, how to make their life better. And I think that is more of a practical solution than to chasing a cause that probably doesn't exist in the first place. Because as we can see, the genetic and biological study have been done for decades, at least 50 years already, and we still can't get a certain conclusion.
Yeah. It looks like feeling like they're sort of looking for a sort of magical solution to the problem, even though there are already like things they found out which are mostly social, just hiding in plain sight, that they can because we do not deny that people with schizophrenia suffer and have a lot of negative consequences because of their symptoms, but I think we generally agree that a lot of harm can already be avoided by taking good care of social environment and people and having a good person first treatment instead of trying to medicalize it and try to solve the problem that way.
To conclude then, I think it's very important that we all specify that what we mean is not that there is nothing harmful about schizophrenia, that there is nothing distressing about the symptoms attached to that diagnosis. We are not suggesting that schizophrenia be outright abandoned by all medical institutions or by medical research. Instead, we suggest that the medical model and the neurodiversity paradigm have more to benefit, and more importantly, schizophrenic people have more to benefit from their being placed in reciprocal conversation rather than considering each other to be antithetical models that split schizophrenia itself down the middle.